It's Electric Drives. Your electric vehicle future starts right now. Welcome to the show. I'm Anthony Algmin, and I'm joined by my co-host, Bob Reese. We created this show to make it easier for others looking to move to electric vehicles, and that's more and more people every day. We're out there using EVs in normal commutes and road trips, and we'll share the wisdom we've gained from living our lives with electric vehicles. You can join in the conversation by sending your questions and topic ideas to questions@electricdrives.us, by joining our Facebook group, or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/electricdrives to get exclusive content and help support the show. Bob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing real good. Real good.
Awesome. So today we're going to talk about some EV myths that are out there. And so today is going to be a little bit of an interesting topic. We're going to cover, there's a article on the EPA.gov website that talks about electric vehicle myths. And because we recognize that this is how you're learning, this podcast is how you're learning about what's out there and what's going on with electric vehicles, we actually want to take this episode and cover some of the content in that and provide our own perspectives on some of these myths. There's 6 of them. And we think this article, and we'll link the article in the show notes so you can see it, and by no means are we claiming that this work is ours in terms of the myths or the facts that we'll talk about, but we'll add some context to it. But hopefully it'll expose some of the things that you may have heard out there and help you understand what is truth and what is just fabrication from some of the stuff out there. So Bob, anything to say before we get started with the myths themselves?
It's like any other type of information you get, consider the source.
That's right. That's right. Well, and this is where this isn't just like Joe's website on electric vehicles. This is the EPA. Like, this is really a reputable site for finding this kind of information. So we thought this was a good place to source this particular conversation. So the first myth on this EV myths is electric vehicles are worse for the climate than gasoline cars because of the power plant emissions. And then the fact is, electric vehicles typically have a smaller carbon footprint than gasoline cars, even when accounting for the electricity used for charging. So, Bob, what do you think about that particular myth?
That's one you hear quite a bit.
Yeah.
And maybe in certain states, you may have more carbon footprint because of the electric generation. But the other thing to think about on some of the generation, especially if you got coal fired plants, is they got so many scrubbers on there. I'm not sure how that compares to some of the diesels I see running down the street. But it depends on the mix that you have of electricity for your particular area. Now, last time I looked, Northern Illinois was extremely heavy on nuclear. Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of windmills that have been coming online. So if you use, generally cars are being refueled in the middle of the night. It's the cheapest electricity at that point in the night. So some of the equipment that would be producing more carbon emissions, such as natural gas peakers and so on, that are strictly used for those afternoon peaking, helping out getting the electricity into the wires, they won't be running in the middle of the night. So typically in the middle of the night, you'll have more of the composite even changes more because you'll have more of your windmills, and you'll have some nuclear and some of the other things that may not produce as much greenhouse gases.
So I like to look at it with the worst case scenario. And the way they do these comparisons is they kind of look at the total carbon footprint from manufacturing the vehicle and then the use of the vehicle. And they say, and this is back of the envelope math, so don't quote me on the exact numbers, but I think it's in the ballpark. The typical car is driven for about 150,000 miles on average. And unless you're in Bob's house and it's much more than that, but if it's 150,000 miles on average. If you look at the typical electric vehicle and charging it with only the most highly polluted source, so 100% coal burning power plant fuel, you will still end up more beneficial or less detrimental from a carbon footprint perspective once you've gone about 75,000 miles. That's the crossover point. Literally everything else is a better case scenario than that. So if the car, which on average cars go 150,000 miles, if you once you go 75,000 miles, you are now hurting the environment less by driving the worst case scenario electric car. So that's one way I like to look at it, is say, okay, what's that worst case? Everything else is gravy. I like to that's how I like to make investments. It's like Shark Tank for electric vehicles, right? So that's one way to think about that particular myth. And then the other thing is that I think just logically, right? So with power plants, granted, you lose some amount of the electricity going through the wires, but that's why they have high voltage lines where they lose a lot less percentage, and then the substations that break it down in the neighborhoods to deliver it, where you lose a little bit more. But it's still way more efficient than blowing things up on 4 rubber wheels that are moving around all the time, and only designed to do that. Like, so you get so much more economies of scale there. Not to mention all of those advanced filters and scrubbers and everything like that. Not to mention, it doesn't have to be so super compact that it can sit inside a vehicle that's moving around all the time. Of course, those are going to be inefficient. I mean, it's just, despite all of the advances of technology, those are going to be more inefficient solutions because they're so small compared to the massive power plants that can really solve for, you know, doing the best they can with the energy that they're producing. So just logically, from a mathematic perspective, from a pragmatic perspective, all of these things, that myth is, it's so frustrating that it's even out there, but people, don't really think through it. So anyway, I think we've covered that one, right? So
Right.
myth number 2, electric vehicles don't have enough range to handle daily travel demands. The fact is, electric vehicle range is more than enough for typical daily use in the US. Bob, take it away, because I think you are point positive that this is possible. Well, that was a lot of alliteration there, wasn't it?
Yes, yes. Yeah, because they're saying that the average commute around is approximately 50 miles average per day. And a majority of the vehicles on the road, even the guy that bought the Leaf a couple of episodes ago, that one came out with 75 miles range from the factory. And it may have lost some range, but still, it's still beating the average. And most EVs now are doing 200 miles or more in range. So, yeah, I'm driving to Quad Cities tomorrow, and that's 180 miles each way. So, yep, no problem.
Yeah, I mean, it is no problem. And two, if you happen to be working from home now, perhaps, or for 20 years I was taking a train to downtown Chicago. My drive to the train station was 2.5 miles. It was a little too long to walk. Sometimes I would actually ride my bicycle there, but driving the car, an electric vehicle on that short drive would be perfect. And then all the around town stuff, I could literally have that same Nissan Leaf that we were talking about a couple episodes ago. That would have been a great car for me because I only need to go like 5 miles at a time. And even in the local stuff that I'd be doing, I don't think I ever was driving my car more than 10 or 15 miles unless I was taking it on a road trip somewhere. And as you've said, there's a lot of ways you can do those road trips. Even if you have one of those shorter mileage cars, there are other ways you can rent a car for a road trip or what have you. Or if you have another car, we have a minivan. I would just be taking the minivan on the road trips anyway. And so a lot of ways you can do that. That myth is just straight out. We know that's baloney. If you've listened to any of the episodes on the show, you know that is absolutely, totally a myth. Okay, myth number 3. Electric vehicles only come as sedans. Fact, electric vehicles now come in a variety of shapes and sizes. What was this written like 5 years ago? Because like, I don't even know that there's more, like, sedans are probably not even the most common form factor for electric vehicles anymore, I think.
No, because I think the Model Y for Tesla is their biggest seller, I believe. It outsells the Model 3, in fact.
Yeah.
So that's considered a small SUV, I believe.
Yeah, small
And
SUV
then,
or the crossovers. You got the Mustang Mach-E, you've got the
right,
Volkswagen. Like all of these seem to be kind of crossover is the one where all these manufacturers are starting crossover or SUV. And I get that they want to have that form factor because it really works well with like a battery and all of that.
right,
But
right.
yeah, especially when it comes to a sporty sedan, I was like, I don't have too many options for this. It was like the one that I had, or an e-tron or a Taycan, both of which were way too expensive for what I wanted in purchasing a car. So yeah, now there's a lot more than a plain old sedan, and you even now have the Ford Lightning and the
Yep,
Rivians, and
yep,
there's a
yep.
lot more coming out. What surprises me though is that we haven't yet seen a full electric minivan. And I would have thought like a full electric minivan would be absolutely a great fit for the electric vehicle world. Like, why do you think that is? Why don't we have an electric vehicle minivan yet? Is it just that minivans aren't cool anymore? Is that the problem?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see because I believe Volkswagen's got a target for like 2 years from now to come out with the bus again. Uh, the What was that? The minibus, the
ID
microbus.
Buzz, is that the is ID
Yes,
Buzz
yes.
is the
So they're going to
minibus?
come out
Yeah,
with that type of vehicle. Then I'm not sure.
yeah.
It, Chrysler has a plug-in hybrid version,
Mm-hmm.
which you can run like 30 miles and then run gas the rest of it, and that may qualify as some of the getting under those 50-mile ranges type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that may be a good option too, especially because I think a lot of minivans do see higher mileage because that is definitely a road trip type of car when you're putting the whole family in and what have you. But I do feel like there's an opportunity there if someone would take it, though I think a lot of folks want to have the larger SUVs still. Minivans just aren't cool. See, I grew up when station wagons were the not cool thing and minivans were the ones that you wanted. And so I still
Right, right.
struggle with this notion that minivans aren't cool. But hey, that's what the kids say. I'll listen to them. So, all right, moving on to myth number 4. There is nowhere to charge. The fact is, electric vehicles can be plugged into the same type of outlet as your toaster. When you need to charge while on the road, you'll find over 45,000 stations in the U.S. available to the public. And I know that number has grown since this had come out. But
Articles, yeah.
yeah. So what do you think, Bob? Like, can the average person, because here's the thing, like we've talked on this show already about apps and
Yep.
planning your charges and all of that, and I think about, I have parents that are getting older, for example, and they got a question even just today from my dad, and it was how do I clear the cookies on my computer, and should I do
Mm-hmm.
that? And that's
Mm-hmm.
not an irrational question. That's a fairly good question to ask if you don't know what's going on there. But the comfort that I may have or you may have with some of the technology and some of the apps and some of the things that you have to figure out in a different way than what you've done for your entire life, that may be asking a lot. And so do you think that the average person, somebody like my dad who didn't know what the cookies meant and whether or not they were a danger to his computer, is that something that is ready for prime time? Or if not, what do we need to do to make it ready for prime time? Or do you think, hey, anybody can go plug it into the level 1 outlet, let it charge slowly, and if you can manage the relatively slow recouping of
Mm-hmm.
the recoupment, I don't even know if that's a word. How do you get the miles back, the energy back into the battery? If can you manage that, or are we asking too much too early in the life cycle of these electric vehicles to say this can be mainstream now? Because I think that's really what that myth is hitting on, right?
Well, when you were talking about the first point, which was, or the second point, when you're talking about the range and the average person's driving 50 miles, you can definitely do that on a level 120 volt outlet. And without having to go 220 or 240. So that does make it doable. But I think this also gets to the point that with gas stations, you see enormous signs saying gasoline.
That's a good point.
And you don't see it for electric vehicles. There's a Casey's in, forgotten the name of the town, in Illinois that has DC fast chargers, Geneseo.
Mm.
And I've been stopped by a number of people when I've been charging there. They go, does this charge electric vehicles? What do you do to it? How do you plug it in?
Mm-hmm.
So it's out in plain sight, and people go in there and plug in all the time to fill their gas tanks, but they don't realize that they can charge their cars.
Yeah.
So again, the apps are going to be probably the biggest thing of driving people to the chargers, and that may be good, because the cars will have that native on their computer. So say, okay, there's a charger here.
Mm-hmm.
You can make this charger, or you can make this charger farther down the street. That type of thing. It's going to really help out.
It's certainly an easier thing to navigate overall with these applications, with the built-in navigation tools in the cars themselves, compared to like if we were trying to manage this transition and all we had were paper maps like we did back in the day.
Yep,
And that's
yep.
how we traveled. Like that would be really, really difficult to manage, and it would take much longer for EVs to fully take hold because like we mentioned in previous episodes, sometimes these chargers are buried in a parking lot somewhere. You don't know where they are at all, and they're not at gas stations. They're at big box stores, or they're at an electric
Right.
company that wants to promote electric vehicle charging, or they're at a Harley Davidson or something. Like you just don't know that they're there unless you have an app that tells you that they're there. And that's that requires it. So Bob, I mean, you and I both, I would imagine, agree that at some point electric vehicles inevitably become mainstream.
Oh,
How
yeah.
long do you think that takes? How long is it until we have the equivalent of big billboard gas stations that say gas $4.59 a gallon, but for electric vehicles and
Oh,
everywhere?
and I sent you a picture of one that I
Yeah.
had found that was doing that and saying how much it was per kilowatt for the electric cost. So it is in the works.
Mm-hmm.
If you drive down I-55, Pontiac, Illinois, there's a gas station called Wally's that has a ton of gasoline pumps and so on. But there's a whole separate island with 4 chargers and a canopy, and with water and squeegees to clean off your windshields, that's set up for electric vehicles. So it's going to be here down the road. And I've also mentioned that there's a couple Amoco stations that are toying with it, where they'll have, in conjunction with Volta, they'll have a charging station on the premises in addition to the gasoline pumps. And that's to drive you the business inside to pick up the
Mm-hmm.
soda pop and the sandwiches and all the other things. And by the way, those 2 that I know of have modified. Originally, they were set up as a half-hour free charge, and now they've set it up where they're doing 10 minutes of free charge. But still, it's designed for you to come in, charge up, get something to drink, use the restroom, and be on your way.
Yeah, get a little bit of charge and move on. I would say, I think it's going to be probably 2030 by the time we see real ubiquity in terms of all the charging we could want, plenty of different options, enough coverage. I think we just have a lot of vehicles hitting the road, and that's great. But I think that there's a lot of bigger problems to solve when it comes to just delivering that amount of charge to places. And I think one of the big things that will be helpful in that is the use of batteries to help be capacitive in some of these stations, so they can draw at a lower rate than they can deliver, because they can build up into the batteries an amount without having to have these massive power supplies going all over the place, because these are significant amounts of electrical draw that hit the grid in ways that in those spots they just haven't needed before. So there is some build out infrastructure wise that we're going to have to be thinking about. I don't know that the total net is going to be a hugely different world from an electricity need perspective. It's just shifting in some different ways, but I think the delivery mechanisms is where we have some work to do, and I think that's just going to take some time to stabilize and catch up and find the right business model to support it, because that's where the installation of these things, fast chargers, could be 6 figures easily, and it's hard to get that back at 34 cents a kilowatt. So
Yeah.
all right, well,
Yeah.
let's move on to the next myth is electric vehicles. So myth number 5: electric vehicles are worse for the climate than gasoline cars because of battery manufacturing. So myth number 1 was talking about the power plant emissions. Myth number 5 is about the battery manufacturing. And so
Well, I think you got into that with that 7,500 mile or 75,000 mile break even point.
That's right. And so the fact that is stated in the article. So the fact is the greenhouse gas emissions associated with an electric vehicle over its lifetime are typically lower than those from an average gasoline powered vehicle, even when accounting for manufacturing. And so, yes, Bob, like you said, we did kind of talk about this already as part of myth number 1, but I think that all kind of goes together. And really, it's recognizing that the total package is what matters here, is the total carbon impact, the environmental impact of the whole thing. And granted, I don't think anybody today is really happy with where the state of batteries are. They use too many precious metals. They're too difficult to manufacture. They're too difficult to totally recycle. But we're getting better. Every year, there's massive amounts of research going into battery technologies. There's massive amounts of improvements happening in how we're able to manufacture and then deconstruct or find alternative uses. And that's one of the things to keep in mind too. Just because a battery may no longer be useful in the context of a car, it can very much be useful in the context of, say, home battery backups or other kinds of uses and industrial uses or what have you. So you don't necessarily need to deconstruct the battery itself. You just may find, hey, this thing's going to be useful for another 10 or 15 years in another way than powering an electric vehicle, which puts a lot of demands on that battery. So keep in mind, there's a lot of developments here, and even in the current state, we're already well past the point where electric vehicles are better for the environment than gas-powered cars, full stop. That is truth, is that electric vehicles are better for the environment than gas-powered cars. That is the fact. And that's today, and it's only going to get better. Just like my comparison, if you drive the car 75,000 miles with the worst polluting factories and worst polluting electrical generation, you're still cutting over at about half the life of a normal car. It's only getting better from there with electric vehicle battery manufacturing and the environmental impact of the entire thing. So keep that in mind. So let's move on to myth number 6. Electric vehicles are not as safe as comparable gas vehicles, wherein the fact is electric vehicles must meet the same safety standards as conventional vehicles. So Bob, what are your thoughts on safety in driving and safety in these electric vehicles? What do you think about that?
I think they actually are almost trying to reach a higher standard, because the most vulnerable part of an electric vehicle is the battery. Mm-hmm. And so the batteries are extremely well designed and reinforced and integrated into the body of the car to avoid, if you had a collision, you got your crumple zones and so on, and the batteries are designed to withstand a lot of impact and stay intact. So I think they are going to the extra safety levels to try to beat gasoline cars. Gasoline cars, I remember the Ford Pinto where you'd hit it in the rear and the cars would explode. So you're having the same curve with electric vehicles.
Yeah, well, so a couple things to add to that. So one, the electric vehicle batteries are very heavy. And so granted, the car is heavier, but all that weight is localized much lower in the vehicle. So your center of gravity is lower. So rollover risk and all of that from a safety perspective is much lower with electrical vehicles just because of gravitational forces. The second thing that I think is interesting to the point that you were just making around the battery being the most dangerous part, they've long since protected those batteries with everything they've got. Now they're saying, hey, you know what? That would be cool. We can use that as part of the structure of the car as well and make the car stronger. And so now they've said, okay, let's take these battery cases, make them structural components of the body frame effectively to make that car itself even more durable, because you've got all this extra strengthening there. So I think that's really cool. And then the other thing, with all of the advanced technology that's going into these electric vehicles, not only do you have fewer moving parts, you have fewer things to fail, you have regenerative braking. So even if your brake line, your caliper brake line for some reason got severed for some reason or what have you, your regenerative braking is going to be able to stop that car, or at least get it to a safe place that you can throw on a parking brake or something like that. There's fewer things to break. The transmission doesn't exist. You've got a bunch, you don't have catalytic converter theft. You don't have a bunch of things that exist in our traditional gasoline powered cars that just are non-issues for electric vehicles. So there's a lot of things like that. And though there are some things that have been bad press for electric vehicles around like battery fires or other conditions like that, don't forget, if you see a car on fire on the side of the road right now, the chances are that is not an electric vehicle. That is probably a gas powered car. Those things burst into flames a lot. And probably, and I don't have the math in front of me, so I don't want to quote this, but I think the rate is still significantly higher for internal combustion cars erupting in flames more often than battery cars, which, I mean, consider you literally have tiny explosions happening thousands of times a minute in your combustion vehicles. It's not a big logical stretch to think that maybe occasionally those might catch on fire. So recognize that all cars have a certain amount of danger to them, and they're certainly not perfectly safe. But I do think the electric vehicle industry and the cars and the technology, not to mention the advanced driver safety features and some of the self-driving stuff that's coming along, is definitely moving us in a direction where cars are getting safer and safer than they've ever been before. And the electric vehicle experience is certainly better as well. Not to mention, I still maintain that it's a safer thing to not have to go to a gas station on a regular basis. I really hated always smelling like gas afterwards. I'm like, that can't be healthy. That's not a good thing to have happen. And all the drips of gasoline all over the place and all of that is just, we can do better than that. And so I think electric vehicles are an opportunity for us to solve some of these things. And hopefully in the conversation that we've had today, these myths have been addressed, and you can check out that article. And certainly, hopefully our conversation today brings a little bit of light to that and gets you interested in that. But the next time somebody, maybe at your work or in your friends group or whatever, says, oh, those electric vehicles are way worse for the environment, now you'll have some ammunition to combat that particular argument and win that fight in your own life. And that's how we can help people understand what the truth is and do our part in this journey towards electric vehicles. Bob, before we go, and once again, in typical Electric Drives fashion, we're way over time, but do you have anything else to add before we go today?
Not today.
All right, everybody. Well, that wraps up our show for today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that YouTube bell icon. Send your questions and topic suggestions to questions@electricdrives.us. If you'd like to get special content and help support the show, please join us on patreon.com/electric drives. Thank you for spending some time with us, and we wish you a smooth road ahead on your own electric drives. Thanks, everybody.